I'll talk about the authorship of that a little bit later, but Section 5 was written at the beginning of the century, several decades before Dodsley's preface. The Section 5 author says, "Rhetoric is the art or faculty of speaking and writing with elegance and dignity in order to instruct, persuade, and please. Grammar only teaches plainness and propriety. Rhetoric lays for its foundation and raises upon them all the graces of tropes and figures. Elegance consists in the purity and clearness of the language. Purity requires choice and proper words, a command of which may be gained by studying the best authors, by conversing with refined company, and by frequent and careful composition. To obtain perspicuity, or clearness, a full knowledge of our subject and frequent close meditation upon it are necessary." So here we see a much earlier version of the purpose of rhetoric. Study writers so that you may write. Thus the preceptor enacts cultural change and cultural contradiction within its own covers. But who did write these specific sections? I want to introduce these writers the way they're introduced in the preceptor, highlighting what is unsaid, sort of behind the scenes of getting these writers. These backstories illustrate how the workings of print created these educational models of English. We know the author of the introduction to Part 1, for example, because the heading to this section is affixed with an asterisk, leading to a footnote in which Dodsley explains that, quote, "This section contains the substance of a late excellent essay on elocution, published since the first edition of the Preceptor by the Reverend Mr. Mason of Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, which I have been persuaded by several eminent schoolmasters to prefix by way of introduction to the lessons on reading and speaking." So Dodsley added this guy in the second edition because he had been convinced that it would be good to do so. According to 19th century sources, Mason, we don't know this Mr. Mason anymore. I had to do some digging to find out who this guy was that everyone liked so much. Mason was a dissenting divine. We might recall that dissenting academies had led the way to an English only as opposed to classical curriculum. He was a dissenting divine, the author of a number of religious works, as well as essays on poetry and rhythm in language. The Dictionary of National Biography states that he was most famous for his 1745 treatise on self-knowledge, a work of practical piety that, quote, "became one of the most popular works of moral advice and self-help of its time, with a popular appeal that lasted into the following century." The essay on elocution that's reprinted in the Preceptor was evidently itself long employed as a textbook at Oxford. My point, though, is that whether or not the schoolmasters of England were beating down his door, exhorting Dodsley to use this, Dodsley could use this text and put it in the Preceptor because it had been originally published by Mary Cooper, a prolific bookseller in her own right, with whom Dodsley worked on a number of projects. A letter from Mason to Dodsley, highlighting what we might call the cultural politics of citation and textual recycling, is worth quoting in full here. So, after the Preceptor comes out, Mason writes to Dodsley and says, "Sir, as my little piece upon elocution had finished its course and was going to submit to the common fate of pamphlets, you do it an honor to prolong its existence by giving it a place in the second edition of the Preceptor. Had I known your intention beforehand, I should have had no objection to it at all. I am obliged to you for the polite acknowledgment you made of the liberty you have taken, than which no other consideration is desired by your humble servant, J. Mason." So, to be clear, copyright, both law and custom in this period, meant that the authors sold, or not the law, but the custom in the period meant that authors sold their rights to their booksellers for a set fee in exchanging for printing and distribution. There was no such thing as royalties or moral rights. Mary Cooper owned the rights to copy, and it was from her that permission had to be granted. It is unclear whether Mason is being facetious in his claim to be obliged for the polite acknowledgement of the liberty taken by Dodsley, but a footnote was neither legally necessary nor, in this era of frequent reprinting and abridgments, usual practice. Indeed, it is notable, if you will, only because so many pieces in the preceptor are unsigned and unacknowledged. Indeed, in naming him so explicitly, Dodsley may have been capitalizing, or not meaning to cite him as much as to capitalize on the fame of Mason's treatise on self-knowledge. Interestingly, a similar acknowledgement occurs at the beginning of Lesson 5 on rhetoric and poetry. Again, an asterisk on the heading sends the reader to the bottom of the page to learn that Dodsley, quote, found this subject so concisely and sensibly handled by Mr. Blackwell in the second part of his introduction to the classics that, despairing to get anything better or more to my purpose, I prevailed with the proprietor of the book to give me leave to make such use of it as would be thought, as he would think proper. In this case, the author, actually Anthony Blackwall, that was difficult when researching that guy, Dodsley's typographical disinterest in the man's actual name seems telling here, was long dead. So Dodsley called him Blackwell. His name is actually Blackwall. And that's never corrected in any of the editions. It is likely that Dodsley heard the reference from Johnson, who, according to Boswell, recommended Blackwall in the classics among a list of educational texts to a friend. Blackwell's book had originally been published in 1718, and its original publisher, Charles Rivington, had also died in 1742, but it had been reprinted by his heirs, James and John Rivington, again, booksellers with whom Dodsley collaborated on a variety of projects as recently as 1746. Interestingly, it was precisely this sort of long-standing family property that the Act of Anne was designed to prevent. The Act was at heart an anti-monopoly piece of legislation, and its subtitle, if you'll recall, an Act for the Encouragement of Learning, referred not just to providing authors with a financial incentive to produce new knowledge, but also to making the terms of protection relatively brief, so 14 years, which could be extended to another 14, so that books could be republished by others and thus more widely disseminated. But Dodsley would not have been interested in the legal technicalities and whether this work was now free from statutory limits. Instead, he chose to follow good, that is, collegial business practice, as well as common law precedent, and so preserve his reputation as an honorable bookseller. It was only through this reputation that he could sell works like The Preceptor. His reputation earned him the authority. So we see how cultural capital and real capital are very closely linked. Dodsley also adds in the same note on Blackwell's chapter on rhetoric that, quote, some small alterations therefore have been made, and many examples from the poets to explain and illustrate the rules exchanged are added, in which last particular alone this treatise seemed defective. So Dodsley's saying, I've amended this. I've added some poets because he doesn't have enough examples. But almost all of these are, in fact, exchanges. I counted 8. 3 of these are Shakespeare, whose popularity had been growing throughout the 18th century, thanks to editors such as Pope, Theobald, Warburton, and eventually Johnson. And although Johnson did not publish Shakespeare until after Dodsley's death, he had been thinking about it and talking about it since 1745. Shakespeare also accounts for the 2 more extras added in. The rest are living writers or recently deceased writers whose work Dodsley published. His erstwhile patron Pope, Matthew Prior, Christopher Pitt, and his dear friend John Spence. The extra examples provided then served to promote Dodsley's stable of writers. Students looking to observe further examples, as the preface had instructed, could be supplied with a complete text at Tully's Head. If they weren't sure which ones to choose, there were volumes, like Dodsley's A Complete Collection of Poems, filled with these same poets and others. This is not meant to be a cynical statement. These were people Dodsley counted as friends, colleagues, and collaborators, now and potentially in the future, whose work he knew well and thought highly of. That he also made money on this is not beside the point, but it's not the only point either. For a mid-century bookseller promoting new notions of authorship, art and commerce did not need to be disaggregated. Thus it is appropriate, I'm concluding now, that Volume 1 of this educational treatise, this new multidisciplinary anthology, All the Knowledge Fit to Print, concludes with